I've always believed land carries history, and if you listen closely enough, you can hear the voices of the past whispering through the soil. That's exactly how I feel about my ranch, an old piece of property that has been in my family for nearly 2 centuries. This land wasn't just real estate, it was blood, sweat, and sacrifice preserved through time. Every fence post, every weathered barn door, and every oak tree standing tall had a story to tell. The ranch was passed down from my great-great-grandfather, a man who carved his life out of the wilderness when the West was still wild. My family managed to hold on to it through wars, economic crashes, droughts, and even family disputes. Through it all, the ranch remained the one place no one could take from us. That was until the HOA showed up. Now, I don't live in a subdivision, nor do I own some cookie-cutter house with white fences lined up perfectly down a cul-de-sac. My ranch sits just outside of town, sprawling across hundreds of acres, with a line of barbed wire fencing separating it from the nearest development. For decades, nobody bothered me. Then the suburbs began creeping closer, swallowing farmland and pushing against property lines. That's when the trouble began. The Homeowners Association, or HOA as everyone calls them, decided my land would be better suited for their expansion. They wanted to buy me out, tear down my barns, bulldoze my fields, and replace them with rows of overpriced houses that all looked the same. I laughed the first time they approached me. "Son," I told the slick-haired man in a pressed suit who showed up at my door, "this land ain't for sale." It wasn't for sale when my great-grandfather was alive, it wasn't for sale when my father held it, and it sure as hell ain't for sale now that it's mine. He smiled like a snake and handed me a contract, his eyes gleaming with greed. I didn't even look at it before tearing it up in front of him. He wasn't happy about that, but I didn't care. That's when Karen entered the picture. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, you know there's always one person who takes things way too seriously. In this case, it was a middle-aged woman named Karen. She had the classic persona, blonde bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, designer clothes, and an ego bigger than the Texas sky. From the moment she laid eyes on my ranch, she acted like it belonged to her already. She didn't approach me like the suit had. She came storming up my driveway in her SUV one afternoon, rolled down her window, and barked, "You need to sell. The HOA has decided it's time this land was put to proper use." I looked at her like she'd lost her mind. I said calmly, "With all due respect, the only person who decides what happens to this ranch is me. And I'm not selling." She narrowed her eyes. "You don't understand. The community wants this. You'll be compensated fairly." "I understand perfectly," I said, leaning on the gate. "You want to tear down 200 years of history for a row of vinyl-sided houses. And that ain't happening." That's when her face turned red. I swear steam practically poured out of her ears. She huffed, slammed her SUV door shut, and sped off. I thought that was the end of it. I couldn't have been more wrong. For weeks, Karen and the HOA hounded me. They sent letters in the mail, all formal offers, dressed up in legal jargon. I tossed them straight into the fire pit. They had realtors call me, lawyers threaten me, and surveyors show up at my gate like they owned the place. I made it clear every single time, this ranch is not for sale. But Karen, she wasn't used to being told no. The final straw came one hot summer afternoon. I was mending a section of fence when I saw dust kicking up from the road. Sure enough, Karen's SUV was barreling down my drive again. This time, she didn't bother with pleasantries. She slammed the car door, marched up to me, and got right in my face. "You listen here, old man," she spat. "This land is ours whether you like it or not. The board has approved the acquisition, and you will sell." I stood up straight, looking her dead in the eye. No, I said firmly. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Her face twisted into something ugly. And then she did something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a pistol, and aimed it straight at me. The world slowed down in that moment. I could hear the cicadas buzzing in the trees, the distant low of cattle in the pasture, and my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I wasn't scared, not the way most people might expect. I was furious. This was my home. My land. My family's legacy. And this woman had the audacity to threaten me with a gun just because I told her no. Last chance, she sneered. Sell, or else. I took a step closer, staring her down. Lady, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. That was the moment things escalated far beyond contracts, offers, and legal threats. Karen had crossed a line she could never step back from. She thought she could intimidate me, scare me into giving up what generations before me had fought to preserve. But she was dead wrong. Because if there's one thing you don't do, it's pull a gun on a rancher defending his land. And that was the beginning of the end for Karen. When Karen pulled that pistol on me, I realized just how far she and her precious HOA were willing to go. I'd dealt with threats before, bankers trying to foreclose during rough years, cattle rustlers thinking they could outsmart me, even wild animals prowling too close to my herd. But never in my life had I faced a suburban HOA queen pointing a gun at my chest. I didn't flinch. Not once. She was expecting me to crumble, to throw my hands up and surrender like some coward who didn't know what real grit was. But I've spent my whole life on this land. I know what it means to dig fence posts in 100-degree heat, to haul hay bales till your back aches, to stare down coyotes in the dead of night. A woman like her, she didn't know hardship. She knew power plays. She knew intimidation. But she sure as hell didn't know me. Put that thing down, I told her, my voice steady. You don't have the guts to use it. Her hand trembled just enough to give her away. She wanted me to believe she was dangerous, but the truth was written all over her face, fear, desperation, and rage all mixed together. Don't test me, she snapped. I'll. That was when I cut her off. No, you won't. You're trespassing on my land, threatening me with a firearm, and breaking more laws than I can count. You pull that trigger, and it won't be me the sheriff drags off in cuffs. It'll be you. For a moment, she froze. Her lips quivered, her eyes darting like she was calculating whether I was bluffing. Then, just as fast as she had drawn the gun, she lowered it and shoved it back in her bag. But instead of apologizing, instead of backing down, she did what people like her always do, she doubled down. You'll regret this, she hissed, spinning on her heel. I'll make sure you lose everything. I'll have the entire HOA on you, and when we're finished, this ranch will be nothing but rubble. She stomped back to her SUV, gravel spitting from her tires, as she peeled out of my driveway. Most folks might have let the sheriff handle it right then and there. And don't get me wrong, I called the law the moment she was gone. But I also knew this wasn't going to end with a single police report. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She was the type to scheme, to push, to claw until she got what she wanted. And I wasn't about to let her take my land out from under me. So I did what any smart rancher would do, I prepared. The first thing I did was set up cameras all around the property. I'm talking motion sensors, trail cams, even a few discreet ones tucked into the trees. I wasn't about to let her, or anyone else from that HOA, sneak onto my land without evidence. Next, I called a meeting with my neighbors. Some of them were ranchers like me, others were just folks living on the outskirts of town, but we all had one thing in common: we hated the way that HOA was swallowing up land like a wildfire. Karen thought she was powerful, but what she didn't realize was that out here, community still meant something. When I told them what had happened, how she pulled a gun on me, you could see the anger in their eyes. Old Pete, who owned the farm down the road, slammed his fist on the table. She ain't gonna push us around like that. We stand together, or we'll all get bulldozed one by one. Damn right. But Karen wasn't idle, either. Within a week, I started noticing strange things. Cars parked just a little too long near my property line. Surveyors pretending to check the land. Flyers being mailed out, claiming the HOA was developing a new luxury community, where my ranch stood. The kicker? They called it Karen's Ridge. That woman had actually named the proposed development after herself, as if she already owned my land. That's when I realized this wasn't just about money or power. For Karen, it was personal. She wanted to erase me, erase my family's history, and replace it with her name. And I wasn't about to let that happen. A few nights later, I was sitting on my porch when I heard something out by the barn. At first, I figured it was just coyotes sniffing around, but when I grabbed my rifle and went to check, I found something else entirely. Spray paint. Someone had tagged the side of my barn with the words, "Sell or else." That was the final straw. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a plan forming in my head. If Karen wanted a war, she just declared it. The next morning, I drove into town and paid the sheriff a visit. Sheriff Callahan had been around longer than I had. He was a grizzled old cowboy with a badge, and he didn't take kindly to people stirring trouble in his county. When I showed him the photos from my cameras, his jaw tightened. There was Karen, trespassing on my property. There was her SUV idling near my cattle gate. And there was the fresh graffiti sprayed across my barn. This is enough to press charges, he told me. But I'll warn you now, people like her, they've got lawyers. She's gonna drag this out. That's fine, I said. I've got more patience than she does. But Karen wasn't patient. She was reckless. And the next move she made would push this feud into dangerous territory. A week later, I woke up to the sound of engines. Not one, not two, but a whole convoy of vehicles lined up on the road outside my ranch. HOA board members, contractors, even a couple of men in hard hats. They were there, pointing, measuring, acting like they already owned the place. And right at the front of it all was Karen, smug as ever. I marched down to the gate, my boots kicking up dust, my voice booming across the field. "You're trespassing. Turn those trucks around and get off my land." Karen just smiled, arms crossed. "Not for long, cowboy. Papers are being filed. This will all be HOA property soon enough." That was it. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about defending my land anymore. It was about teaching Karen a lesson she'd never forget. And I had just the plan to take her down, for good. When you're used to living off the land, you learn to read things most folks miss. Footprints in wet soil. The pattern of trucks coming and going. The way the wind shifts at the edge of a pasture. All of that tiny information adds up, and in Karen's case it told me exactly what she was doing and how she planned to do it. First, I tightened my evidence network. The cameras I'd put up turned out to be worth every penny. Night cams caught license plates. Motion sensors logged time stamps. A tiny body cam I'd slipped into the brim of my old hat recorded the exchange, when Karen first pulled her gun, audio that would become the gold standard of proof later. I made duplicate copies of everything and gave them to Sheriff Callahan to hold in evidence. I didn't want this to be a he said she said circus. I wanted a neat paper trail with timestamps, names, and faces. Next, I leaned on the one thing Karen hadn't counted on, people. Out here, community still has teeth. The farmers and small business owners in the valley had seen the HOA bulldoze their neighbors' peaceful lives into tract housing. They didn't much like that idea. So when I called a meeting at the feed store, the place was packed. Folks who'd never said 2 words to me in the past came forward with stories of their own, threats, forged signatures, blueprints filed with wrong parcel numbers. An old school teacher handed me a stack of notarized statements where folks swore they'd never agreed to any HOA sale or annexation for my property. Even more damning were the receipts one contractor sneaked across, payments from an account linked to the HOA's development fund to a consultant who, as it turned out, was one of Karen's close friends. We all knew power could buy lawyers, but it couldn't change video footage, sworn statements, or the sheriff with a badge who wasn't interested in covering up a crime. I worked at that evidence like someone plowing a frozen field, methodically, with endurance. I organized the files, made a timeline, and highlighted the parts where Karen's behavior went beyond aggressive HOA negotiation and into the territory of conspiracy, intimidation, and trespass. I built a narrative that a judge could follow without getting lost in HOA legalese. Then I fed it to Callahan and the county prosecutor. They didn't need convincing. Once the audio of Karen's voice, pistol in hand, demanding I sell was paired with photos of her SUV parked deep inside my property, the case turned from civil dispute to criminal. But paperwork and warrants don't always stop someone desperate and vindictive. That's why the other part of my plan was public exposure. If the HOA wanted to pretend it was acting above board, we'd shine a light so hot it burned. I called the local paper. I called a regional radio host who had no patience for small-town corruption. I sent the photos, the video, and the timeline. The story hit the front page the next morning. Rancher claims HOA threatened with firearm, development dispute turns criminal. When the paper ran the headline, the reaction was immediate. Phone calls came in from people who'd been quietly watching from the sidelines. A county official, who had been fielding complaints about dubious HOA activity, overnight asked for a meeting. Even a couple of the HOA board members, people who hadn't realized what they'd signed on for, started backing away when a reporter called them and asked hard questions about their process and approvals. We planned the sting down to small details. If Karen thought simple intimidation and paperwork would be enough to force me, she was naive. The morning the county served the HOA with an injunction and a cease and desist, I made sure there were people at every gate, every entry point. The sheriff's deputies were present, and cameras were rolling. When the HOA's contractor convoy pulled up, they were met with a cluster of neighbors, reporters, and 2 deputies reading them the order to stand down. The look on Karen's face, when she realized the trucks wouldn't move, was something I'll not soon forget, half fury, half disbelief. That alone, though, didn't finish it. Karen still had a network, an army of petty grievances and well-placed phone calls. The turning point came when the county auditors followed the paper trail we'd built and discovered an unauthorized set of transactions. Funds labeled for community outreach had been redirected. Some payees were shell companies. One ledger entry had Karen's signature beside a payment to an LLC registered in her name. That was the smoking gun the prosecutor needed. The arrest itself was clean and quiet. Sheriff Callahan handled it the way he always handled serious business: no fanfare, no press conference at the jail. He drove up to Karen's house with a small team, placed the handcuffs on her while she sputtered and demanded cameras. The charges were a mixture of felony and misdemeanor counts, intimidation with a deadly weapon, trespass, fraud, and falsifying HOA records. She was taken in, booked, and arraigned. The headlines the next day were worse for her. HOA head arrested, rancher's evidence leads to criminal case. But the story wasn't just legal. I had to be careful to avoid the trap of becoming the villain in someone else's retelling. Some corners of the internet, and a couple of loud talk radio callers painted me as the stubborn rancher who fought the HOA. They didn't hear the gun click or see the audio file. So I kept sharing the facts, release the bodycam clip, post the timeline, let the sheriff corroborate. Truth, unvarnished and documented, is a stubborn thing. The HOA didn't survive intact. Within weeks, their board dissolved in a messy meeting where members argued and pointed fingers at each other while neighbors looked on. Developers who had been eager to buy up land suddenly pulled out when lenders refused to touch a project mired in legal trouble and bad press. The shell companies were traced and dissolved. Contractors who had accepted questionable checks were either fined or lost their licenses. With Karen gone and the HOA in shambles, I wasn't out to gloat. This wasn't a personal victory so much as justice doing what it was meant to do. I did go to court to make sure the property deeds and easements were clarified, and that future attempts at forcible annexation would face greater scrutiny. I worked with the county to place protections around parcels with historic significance, and pushed for a public registry that required validated homeowner consent before any sale could proceed. At home, things slowly returned to a familiar rhythm: dawn milking, fences to mend, children of neighbors running through the grass. But the lessons lingered. People started to look at HOAs differently. They asked more questions at board meetings, demanded transparency, and refused to be bullied into giving up what mattered to them. Karen's saga became a cautionary tale: how a small taste of power can twist a person, and how greed aligned with entitlement can bring even the most confident schemers down. I'd defended more than just land. I'd defended a legacy, a community, and a principle. Some things aren't for sale. The morning after Karen's arrest, the ranch was quiet again. The only sounds were the ones I'd grown up with: the wind rustling the oak leaves, the creak of the barn door, and the steady shuffle of cattle in the pasture. It struck me how quickly life had a way of balancing itself when you stood firm. For months, my home had been ground zero for intimidation and threats, but now, the place felt like it could breathe again. No trucks lined up outside my gate, no strangers taking photos, no HOA stooges pretending they had authority here. Just me, my land, and the same sun rising over the hills that my great-great-grandfather once watched. But while the peace returned to the ranch, the storm still swirled in town. Karen's trial became the talk of the county. People packed into the courthouse just to catch a glimpse of her, some out of morbid curiosity, others because they'd been wronged by her and wanted justice done. The evidence spoke louder than anyone's opinion. The recording of her pulling a gun left the jury stone-faced. The paper trail of fraudulent payments destroyed any illusion that this was just a civil misunderstanding. Even some of her old allies on the HOA board turned on her, testifying that she pressured them, bullied them, and forced them to sign off on documents they hadn't read. The verdict came down swift and hard: guilty on multiple counts. She was sentenced to several years in prison, with fines so steep they stripped away the last of her ego-driven empire. For a woman who thrived on control, the sight of her being led out in handcuffs was the end of the story she'd written for herself. But for me, it wasn't about watching her fall. It was about what rose up in the aftermath. The county took serious steps to prevent anything like this from happening again. Regulations were rewritten. A new oversight committee was formed, not controlled by developers or power-hungry board members, but by a mix of landowners, legal experts, and elected officials. They put teeth into the laws protecting historic land, making it near impossible for a private association to bully its way into an annexation again. My ranch became something of a symbol in the process. Reporters kept trying to paint me as the lone cowboy standing against modern progress, but I never saw it that way. I wasn't against growth. I wasn't against communities building themselves up. What I was against was greed, stripping history, bulldozing legacy, and erasing the past for the sake of a few people's egos. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves started dropping by more often. Old Pete brought over a case of cold beer one evening, slapped me on the back, and said, "You didn't just save your land. You saved all of ours." He wasn't wrong. If I'd rolled over, if I'd given in when Karen waved money or threats in my face, it would have set a precedent. The HOA would have steamrolled everyone in the valley, one farm after another. Instead, they learned there were lines you don't cross. Life on the ranch carried on much the same, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't notice the difference. People looked at me differently in town, more respect in their eyes, sometimes even awe. I never wanted to be anyone's hero, but I understood it wasn't about me as much as what I represented: stubbornness when it mattered, a refusal to be bought, and proof that standing your ground could actually work. Some nights, sitting on the porch, I thought about Karen. About how entitlement can poison a person's soul so deeply they are willing to ruin lives to get what they want. I wondered if prison would humble her, or if she'd still be scheming behind bars. Either way, it wasn't my concern anymore. My fight with her was finished. What mattered was the land. The ranch stayed in the family, untouched and unbroken, just as it had for 200 years. The barn still stood, weathered but strong. The cattle still grazed, the fields still grew, and the history still lived in every acre. My kids, and their kids someday, would inherit more than property. They'd inherit proof that some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost. One evening, months after the trial, Sheriff Callahan stopped by. He leaned against his cruiser, sipping coffee from an old thermos, and looked out at the land with me. "You know," he said, "we get a lot of folks in this county who think money gives them power. But you reminded everyone there's another kind of power, the kind that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for." I nodded, not saying much. He was right, but I didn't need the credit. I just needed the quiet, the peace, the knowledge that my ancestors would be proud. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: contentment. The fight was over, the land was safe, and the legacy endured. Karen thought she could take me down with threats and intimidation. Instead, she was the one who fell, undone by her own arrogance. And me. I was still here. Still standing. Still the owner of a 200-year-old ranch that no HOA, no Karen, and no amount of greed could ever take away.